Hey, hope you're doing well. Um, in a recent episode of Brett McKay's The Art of Manliness podcast, he and his guest Jay Heinrichs make a mistake about induction and Sherlock Holmes. Now, induction goes from particulars to a universal, a generalization. Deduction applies that generalization to a particular or something less general. Um, I'll put some resources up so you can look at it for yourself. But here's what he and his guests say, making a mistake.
They actually make me feel better in the long run.
Okay, so we talked about pathos. Let's talk about logos. That's logic. So what is Aristotelian logos? Because it's not how we think it is. I think typically we think of logos as got to be these iron-clad arguments, no fallacies. Aristotle didn't think that when it comes to logos.
No, not when it comes to rhetorical logos, which isn't pure logic. In fact, it can be the opposite. Fallacies can actually convince people. But, even his formal logic has confused people for centuries.
Oh, man. There was a period I went through Aristotle's, works, Nicomachean Ethics is great, metaphysics interesting, and then I get to his book about syllogisms. I'm like, oh, just started snoring. This was not fun.
Oh, God, topics, even worse.
Yeah.
Even Sherlock Holmes gets it wrong, gets Aristotelian logic wrong. He talks all the time about using deduction to solve crimes when he's actually using induction, which is a kind of logic that gathers facts and uses them to make a conclusion. And actually I talk about formal logic that way because actually...
All right, so they are deeply fundamentally wrong. That's not what Sherlock Holmes did. That's not what induction is. But as I say, first of all, good podcast. Brett McKay works on making himself better, helps other people try to be better as well. He's got a wide range of topics on his podcast. Recommend it. There's so many. Not everyone is for everybody. I like some of them. Don't listen to some others. But you can go through the list. I think he's got thousands now. And probably find something that you'd like, a podcast episode and information in there. He's talked about, for example, he's talked about Louis L'Amour and had, I think, maybe his son on. He's had, who is it? Let me look at this list here. Get up. This, who is it? Louis L'Amour and Lee Child, yes, of the Jack Reacher novels. He said Lee Child on his podcast, and that was awesome. Thank you, Brett. Man, that was great. I was surprised to see that one, but I liked it. And then he's had guests on there about weightlifting, physical fitness. He's had, who is it? I guess I'm getting tired. It's late. Kind of sort of need dinner or something. Kind of getting a little brain dead. But, Erwin LaCour. Brett has had Erwin LaCour on an episode to talk about the MovNat system, MOVNAT, and other people on there. There's just so many I've listened to. I forgot them all. But, again, I like that he does that. I like the podcast. I like that he's working to make himself better and help other people be better and more disciplined and everything. So, it's in that spirit. But unfortunately, like us all, he makes a mistake on this thing. I make mistakes too. So they say Sherlock Holmes used induction, and we can listen to that again.
Talk about trees.
Oh, man. There was a period I went through Aristotle's works, Nicomachean Ethics is great, metaphysics interesting, and then I get to his book about syllogisms. I'm like, oh, just started snoring. This was not fun.
Oh, God, topics, even worse.
Yeah.
Even Sherlock Holmes gets it wrong, gets Aristotelian logic wrong. He talks all the time about using deduction to solve crimes when he's actually using induction, which is a kind of logic that gathers facts and uses them to make a conclusion. And actually,
Okay, so there are many errors in there. I don't even know where to equate what the problem is with the guest or with Brett, but induction is not merely something that uses facts to make conclusions. There's so many other things that applies to. I mean, does deduction not use facts to make conclusions? It didn't make much sense. In that case, deduction would have nothing to do with the world. It'd be just lost in our head. We wouldn't use it because if it doesn't tell us about facts, what's the point? Why bother, But logic is about making sure our concepts and propositions, our statements, are tied to reality and make sense so that we're thinking about facts when we're thinking logically. That's like the whole point, whether it's inductive or deductive. It's not merely that induction is to do with facts and deduction doesn't. So if you dig into things, you look into philosophy and all that, it's in the literature. I can put some stuff in the description field to this video. You can look it up for yourself and see plenty. But as I say, induction is the cognitive process we use to form a generalization. Deduction is the cognitive process of using a generalization on something. So induction goes from particulars to a universal, to a generalization. For example, all men are mortal. There's a lot that goes into this, very different logical structure and cognitive process than deduction, which is a lot simpler. To know this, there's like a lifetime of experience or years of experience that goes into forming this. Okay, but once we get this, then deduction can use it, and we need deduction to bring things we already know into play, to use again and again. The repetition, the uniformity. We learn about a fork, and then we don't freak out when we see a fork in a different state or a different place or a different restaurant. We know what a fork is and how to use it, and we have a lot of generalizations about it. A fork, a spoon, a knife, a plate, a glass. Or we learn about people and about wait staff at a restaurant, and then when you go to a restaurant in the future, this person is going to take your order and deliver your food and stuff like that. We don't freak out that someone comes to the table thinking they're going to attack us, We have these generalizations that we use, and many others, just as Galileo and Newton did. A side note that Sherlock Holmes solving a crime is more like you going to a restaurant, applying knowledge you already had, then it's like you making some scientific discovery for the first time, something that no one's ever discovered before. Sherlock Holmes would move mentally and physically through history and through society to figure out who committed the crime, just like you move through a restaurant using knowledge you already have to figure things out, draw conclusions, and move through the situation. So it's more a matter of, again, there you see, using knowledge you already have, using deduction, not forming new generalizations you've never had before. But one thing about this is, some people think a deduction is a generalization applied to a particular, but that's not the case. It can be applied to, like, a syllogism, a deduction gives you anything. It can apply to a particular thing or another generalization, not more abstract or more general than this. Okay, so that's the idea. Universals apply to particulars or a proposition not more general than it. Because deduction doesn't give you generalization, it applies it to something as general or less. So with this one, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. There's an example of a deduction. Or you could say, all animals are mortal. Man is an animal, therefore all men are mortal. So again, it's a generalization. You're applying one generalization to get another, not to say something about a particular concrete individual thing in the world. Or all things must end. A human is a thing in this world. Things in this world. So all humans must end. Again, it's not applied to a particular, you're getting another generalization from that, but it's less general. So there's the basics of induction and deduction. Now, deduction is used a lot in science, so to say it doesn't apply to facts is a misstatement and not true. Deduction is something that's used in science a lot, along with induction. They're used in combination. But this is the main thing. To get laws, principles, universals, you got to get an induction in the first place. So, when done properly, they both apply to facts. I think a confusion might be that they're thinking they have some kind of like dichotomy between fact and thought. Side note again, so to be a little clearer here, what they might be thinking is, Brett and Jay, they might be thinking about empirical knowledge versus quote unquote pure reason. Like maybe they think deduction would be like what a rationalist like Plato would do, having alleged pure reasoning separate from experience. And then induction would be for someone who's empirical, for maybe some scientist or some man on the street, something like that. That's a distinction I do not all agree with and think is fundamentally wrong, but some people in the history of philosophy believe that. Maybe that kind of stuff is affecting Brett and Jay and what they think about deduction, induction, and Sherlock Holmes. Whereas if you understand it properly, thoughts help us deal with facts. The only thoughts that matter, the only valid ones, are ones about the world that help us understand it. It could be something like that, or maybe they think he makes a mistake that induction's empirical, but deduction's not, but that's not the case either. When you go to a restaurant and you're using deduction and you're using deductive knowledge about forks, people, tables, plates, tablecloths, water and glasses and all this, you're using all this general knowledge you already have, it is empirical. You're working on how to work and deal with the empirical world. Now, Sherlock Holmes did not use induction on his cases because that means he's coming up with generalizations about things. But he's not. Like in A Study in Scarlet, for example, when Watson first meets Holmes, Sherlock Holmes is in a laboratory doing some work on chemistry. He's doing that, and that gives him some generalizations he can use when he's out in the field. Or he does in his everyday life, he's forming generalizations about people's habits based on situation in life, economic class, morality, all these things. He's doing generalizations about the soil in certain parts of London, what the soil is like in different places. He does some experiments on the ashes of cigarettes and cigars. So he studies them, he does some experiments, forms some generalizations, then he's applying those in his cases. Maybe sometimes in his cases, he's got to form a generalization while he's doing it in process, but he's not forming a generalization. He's getting this particular person committed this crime, and he's got to associate facts. Of course, I mean, to know if someone's committed a crime or not, and to figure out who did it, obviously you have to look at facts. Otherwise, then you're like doing a Salem witch trial, you know? Look, they're a witch, they're a witch. Make stuff up and accuse someone falsely. That's not what Sherlock Holmes does. Of course he's immersed in the world and wanting to know who in the real world, in the realm of fact, committed this crime. But it's forming an argument, not forming a generalization, not getting an induction. Not like, he's not doing something like, he doesn't end a case with, oh, Watson, all the planets orbit the sun in elliptical orbits. It's not a generalization like that. Or, Watson, every interaction between things is a case where F equals ma. Or, Watson, all right triangles have sides in the relationship of leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Nothing like that happens. He comes up with a solid argument showing that this person committed the crime. He's got to piece together facts, learn facts that are relevant, toss out ones that aren't, look at possibilities. And like as he says, sometimes he'll say, Watson, when you eliminate all possibilities except one, the one remaining, no matter how improbable or seemingly fantastic, must be true. And remember, that's only if those are the possibilities, as long as you're not leaving anything out. If there's 4 or 5 things, and you eliminate these 3, the one left over must be the correct one, like on a well-designed multiple choice test, like on an SAT or something, or LSAT or whatever. But that's not induction. He's not doing a generalization there. So he uses things like that. He's getting things he knows about, as I say, customs, people's habits, people's professions, people's psychology and morality, people's what he's learned about criminal behavior versus the behavior of non-criminals. He has all that, and he's applying it to the particular situation to form an argument to show someone guilty or innocent. So that's really what's going on. Hopefully, that'll help Brett, help Jay, help other people out there know what Sherlock Holmes is really doing. And it's important because, you need to know induction and deduction to really get science right, understand what it is, know fake science from real science, know when there's a scientist you can trust or not. If you have an idea of what induction and deduction are, which authorities can you trust? Which ones not? That helps you. And I think if Brett knew logic better, delved into it, took it more seriously, knew induction, deduction, argument, I think he could add more value to what he's doing with his podcasts and his interviews and his guests. So, if you know more about arguments and deduction and induction and stuff, you can see more how to put information together to form a conclusion. Then you can see that these three ideas lead to this conclusion. These ideas lead to this conclusion, from which you get this conclusion. You bring in some new piece of evidence, and you get this conclusion. These pieces of evidence lead you to this conclusion. They come together to make this conclusion. These things come together to justify this proposition. These come together to help you reach your final conclusion. Something like that. Like something in science or law. Here we've broken down an argument, or in other words, using that, in the sense of like a thought process. All this stuff comes together to reach this conclusion. He could be talking to a guest and have thought about things beforehand and have questions to ask to see, how did a guest reach the conclusion they did? How can we backtrace it? Like the logical process opposite to induction, the inverse is reduction. Getting a generalization and tracing it back to the evidence of the senses. Induction is a cognitive process that ultimately starts with the evidence of the senses and goes through levels of abstraction, processes of reasoning, new observations, and reaches more abstract, higher level generalizations. But the opposite, starting out with, let's say, F equals G, M1, M2 over R squared, the law of universal gravitation. How do you get that generalization and trace it back to the evidence of the senses? That would be reduction. And that happens sometimes. We're learning something, we got this general idea we learn in society, you learn from other people, but then if you want to understand it on your own and kind of redo the induction, you got to go through a process like that. What did I need to know this? What are all the things I need to know? F equals G, M1, M2 over R squared. So, in other words, like F equals G, M1, M2 over R squared. So we got some constant universal thing in physics, force, the distance between the centers of two things, R squared, like the distance between the center of the earth and the center of the sun, mass of the sun, mass of the earth, M1, mass 1, M2, mass 2, law of universal gravitation. Where did we start and how did we get there? That's hard to figure out, but it's easier to trace back to the evidence of the senses sometimes. What happened? So he'd be able to do something like that. And you can think of it as, if you know induction, deduction, arguments, then talking to guests would be kind of like doing what Sherlock Holmes did and figuring some things out, explaining things, telling a story, or like Abraham Lincoln in solving a law case. That's more like what Sherlock Holmes did than induction. He's solving a case of law, which is what, you get what Sherlock did and you take it to court and you'd use it, and Abraham Lincoln would get it and trace through the steps also, It's like basically the same thing. It's not induction. It's not generalizing. It's forming an argument, or if you want to think about it, forming an explanation. How do you explain that this person was the criminal or that this person was innocent? How do you form an argument for it? How do you explain it? Either way, but that's what's going on when he's doing a law case. And if you understand that, the logic behind it, induction, deduction, classification, definition, argument formation and analysis, then I think, Brett would be able to have a more structured interview sometimes, ask questions, think about some other questions to ask that are more interesting and fundamental, and think about the cognitive process going on and the value process, the normative process, the values, the emotions, the importance of something to people. You might be able to break that down too. But it would help. So that's something I recommend. I think it's something we should all do. It helped Galileo, it helped Isaac Newton, it helped Abraham Lincoln, it helped, people who actually do kind of what Sherlock Holmes does, solve crimes. I think it would help us all kinds of different ways. Podcasting, fitness, all kinds of sciences, engineering, solving crimes, parenting, teaching, learning, everything we do in human life, I think, would benefit from logic because we're learning about the truth. And so logic helps us do that. Helps us know what thought processes we're going through and whether we are right or wrong. And then we have standards to see if we actually understand something or not. So, it's got value. As I say, knowing logic would help us understand science, which is all around us. Science really means not some book stuff, but how the world works, We should know how the world works to achieve our values, get things done, be successful in life. Ignoring how the world works just causes trouble. Or we should know how humans work, how society works. What is the nature of human beings, how they work best together. So what kind of government is best, things like that. But it helps in all kinds of different ways. But I hope that helps. And so we see that what Sherlock Holmes did was not induction. It was deduction in the formation of an argument or an explanation, if you want to think of it that way. He, of course, like every human, had to do some generalization before. As we said, in the laboratory, in the first story, when Watson meets Holmes, when Holmes looked at different places in London and found out their soil characteristics and why they were that way, then he knew that, if you have this kind of soil on your shoe, then that indicates, under some conditions, that the person was there. And he did things about cigars and cigarette ashes. Then he knew about the cost of a cigar or cigarette, where it came from, the tobacco and all that, who made it, things like that. And so we could apply generalizations he formed there to his cases. And then there's all these generalizations he formed throughout life, being observant about people, their habits, their customs, their manners, their psychology, innocent person psychology, criminal psychology, things like that. The psychology of a thief versus the psychology of a murderer. You got these generalizations, which he applies in his case. And sometimes some things you might think are induction or finding a rule, I think are just classification. You are seeing that you find some details and you see a person is a certain way, and you're not forming a generalization about all people or all of something, all of a class, which is what a real generalization is, an induction. When you talk, maybe if you want to talk about induction versus some kind of generalization, if you think rule finding or generalization is broader and induction is specifically getting a generalization about all members of a class, if you want to do it like that. But sometimes, in a lot of what he did was, Sherlock Holmes did, and what we do is not induction, we're just identifying characteristics of something and seeing what its nature is or what some cause-effect relationships are. For example, I already know some math and know what a linear increase is. And then if I see something in the world where when there's a certain step, then there's an increase in some amount by 5. There's like a step in time, 1 hour, there's an increase of 5. 1 more hour, an increase of 5. 1 more hour, an increase of 5. If I know there's that constant thing all the time, then I know that it's a linear increase. It's not a generalization and induction, it's classification. I'm identifying something as the kind of thing that I already know. I'm not forming a generalization. I'm using generalizations that I already have. I have a concept of linear increase. I know about it, the equation, the graph, numerical stuff. And so when I see something in a particular instance, I already know, I've already generalized that that's this kind of thing. I'm just applying it. It's like, oh, when there's these kind of characteristics, this is the kind of thing. It's deduction. All linear increases have these characteristics. This thing has these characteristics, or these characteristics are found with this thing. Therefore, this thing is a linear increase, some kind of thought process like that. That's more what Sherlock Holmes did. Just because it's immersed in the world and factual doesn't mean it's induction. That's what reason should be. Reason is a faculty for the human animal to know the world and to move through it. Unfortunately, because of some bad history of philosophy, people have made some mistakes, got some goofy ideas in our culture. Plato, Immanuel Kant, Popper, David Hume. There's some mistakes about what reasoning is, but if you really think about it, make it logically consistent with everything you know, integrate all you know about reasoning, then pretty clearly it's a faculty that helps us identify what's more abstractly what's going on in perception. It's not separate from it, as Plato thought, and some others, it's part of it. And when you're studying some induction and reason, I recommend you be careful about the philosophy behind it. Not everyone who uses the word induction or the word reason is talking about the same thing. Plato can talk about reason, he can talk about induction. I reject his theory of induction, reject his theory of reason. David Hume can talk about reason and induction. I reject his theory of induction. I reject his theory of reason. Karl Popper can talk about reason and induction. I reject his philosophy and theory of induction. I reject his theory and philosophy of reason. I go more with people I regard as better thinkers like Aristotle, Galileo, and Newton. Newton and Galileo were masters of induction. Karl Popper and David Hume were not. If I want to know how it's done, I want to look at what Newton and Galileo thought and how they did things, not what Karl Popper and David Hume thought. It's interesting to read them. Having a degree in philosophy, I like that. It's interesting, but it's wrong. And look at that. What is their idea about reasoning? What is their idea about induction? Then you got to decide for yourself who you want to believe and why. Make sure you think about it. Look at the different theories. You decide for yourself, and then understand the consequences of a certain philosophy of induction or philosophy of reasoning and see if it's right. And that's part of it. But again, Sherlock Holmes, when he did it, when he investigated a crime, it was an investigation. It was more like figuring out what he needed to do in a case of law or engineering. It's not like he's doing science, like he's delving into new fields and forming new concepts and new generalizations. He's just applying what he did, like an engineer. He takes already established science, an engineer, and uses it in a certain area. Same thing with Sherlock Holmes. He took some established knowledge and he's applying it in a particular case. And he wants to see that this particular thing caused this particular thing. This particular thing causes crime. Okay? It's not all things of a certain kind have a certain effect. It's not all masses of a certain weight are caused to orbit another one by some force or some cosmological phenomena, you know. So that's more what's going on. Sherlock Holmes did induction like everyone has to. Without induction, it's impossible to do deduction. You got to form your generalizations, then you can use them. He did that outside of his cases, and you know, if necessary, sometimes during a case he might have like formed one. But essentially, what he's doing is forming an argument or getting an explanation. And of course, it's factual because you want to know if in actual reality this person actually did this. So, hope that helps clarify what's going on with Sherlock Holmes, how he was reasoning, how it was deduction and argument formation, not induction. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope that helps. Thank you.